Now, civic organizations, including the South African Human Rights Commission, the Legal Resources Centre, Equal Education and Section 27 are launching the Right to Read campaign. Now, the results from the Progress in International Reading Literacy study place South Africa, grade 4 learners, pupils as it were, last out of 57 countries in the global benchmark process. Now, the results reveal that 81% of pupils in grade 4 cannot read for meaning in any language. In fact, for more on this, we're joined by Noncedo Madubedube from Equal Education. Noncedo, a very good morning and a happy Sunday. Thanks for making time for us so early in the morning. Where did we go wrong as a country that our 4th grade learners cannot read for meaning or understanding in any language?
Yeah, so thank you very much for having us. First of all, I hope people understand and recognize that there isn't a better time to launch something like a reading campaign. So on the 31st of August, we will be sitting together at the Constitutional Hill, rightfully so, trying to set the tone and providing some leadership and guidance as these organizations are on a massive campaign for all South Africans to help us make sure that we can improve reading and writing and their kind of comprehension for young children in South Africa just within the next couple of years. Your question is, where did we go wrong? South Africa is still a fairly new democracy, and we've been using the last 20 to 30 years trying to address the inequalities and the history of our education system. So our education system has been playing catch up to get onto the same level, to equalize it, per se. And so the majority of children and young people inside of the system are inside schooling communities and environments that are playing catch up. So that's the one sort of political and socio-political condition. The second thing is that we had made some progress just before COVID. But I think that COVID period, with the various shutdowns and alternative ways of learning, the blended learning approach, for example, people will remember learners were learning off the radio or of tech sort of facilities that could have been online and or using WhatsApp groups for teachers in small groupings for their classrooms. And then we got out of that system with a push from civil society into a circumstance where we had a rotational timetable inside schools. And so learners would go into schools only in ways that allowed them to continue to equitably sort of distance themselves from one another inside classroom situations. But what that meant, because of the unequal education system, is that you had learners in rural Limpopo going to school once a week because of the overcrowding conditions, because of the lack of basic infrastructure inside of the schooling environment. But you also then had a situation where maybe learners in Rondebosch were able to continue going to school 5 days a week. So that period did something in undoing some of the gains and the benefits of what teachers and the education system and departments, both at national and provincial level, were able to roll out as reading interventions over the last maybe 10 years. So where we find ourselves now is a combination of the learning losses of the COVID period, but it's also the socio-political conditions of a very unequal education system. There maybe is a third condition that I just want to put to South Africans this morning, is that it's now known, there's a study that has come out to benchmark that countries that follow an austerity fiscal agenda do tend to have a decline and a drop in their learning outcomes in their education systems. So there's an economic condition, which is a policy choice by our government. There's a socio-political and a backdrop around our history in South Africa. And then there are learning losses of the COVID period. All of these things have put a substantial strain on our education system. And so our foundation phase, which already is historically quite weak, has been further impacted by that period. And so what we're wanting to do as these group of organizations is build consensus in the education sector across all stakeholders for a steady and quite a radical intervention to address this issue in real time, because it's got detrimental circumstances for our future.
Thanks for painting that very clear and elaborate picture for us this morning, Noncedo. When we talk about the radical intervention that needs to happen right now, I mean, I can almost just imagine what's going to happen to this fourth grade learner at the moment when they get to matric, when they become an adult, and so on, moving on to life, right? They've had this problem, which could have been nipped in the bud when they're much younger, and now they are carrying these problems into their adulthood. Obviously, the nation at large will be none the wiser for that. What do we as a community of parents, of guardians, just within society need to do to help the government and the education department, as it were, to help solve this problem?
One of the things that we are seeing, and we must talk some more about this as a country, is that there is shaky political will around a really radical intervention to transform the foundation phase of learning in our system. So let me do this. The first thing is that if people think that we will only see the impact of this 81% of learners not being able to read for meaning at matric level, then they're thinking too far ahead. Because we know that the biggest dropout rates happen between the grades 6 and 10. So in that period, we already lose at least 30% of children that should be inside of the schooling system. And then between grade 10 and 12 is the rest of the 20. So what is going to start to happen is that we're going to see a drastic increase in idle youth and children and young people in the streets of our communities because they've left a schooling system that isn't able to capture their imaginations and or help them catch up to the level of the grades that they're in. That's going to happen to children, but there's also going to be a drop in morale and I think maybe accountability and a sense of responsibility of the teaching profession inside of the schooling environments as well. Because teachers and schooling staff need to also feel supported to run the curricula at the pace and tone that government imagines is necessary. So that's the condition of what will happen inside of our schools. The radical sort of intervention that we're suggesting is a binding minimum norms and standards. So some kind of regulation that says to governments across provinces and at the national level, in order for a school to operate and help address this learning crises, they need 4 basic conditions inside of their schools. And the law compels us, because the right to education, as everyone knows, is immediately realizable. So you can't have an excuse but to provide it as an essential. And so the first thing that we're suggesting is regular standardized testing. And we know that in South Africa's history, it's a very contentious subject. So we're not saying overly standardized systemic testing across multiple grades, but we need some kind of way to run benchmarks for ourselves as a country so we can figure out where the interventions are most useful and necessary. And be able to track achievement of meaningful reading skills and comprehension at different levels of grades. The second is access to reading materials. Here we're making a clarion call to anyone that publicly and freely open source provides reading materials in all of our different languages. To come to the party, to be donating to schools at a very, very local level, but to also follow us on social media platforms as the Right to Read campaign. And we can make connections with different teaching and learning communities. So we can make sure that children, before we make any kind of legal and regulatory intervention, but that children and parents have these resources as they need them. The second is around quality literacy training. So we want to be talking to our institutions of higher learning. We want to be talking to interventions in our sector and scale those to make sure that the teaching profession itself feels that they can in fact teach reading and writing. But we also want to create opportunities for young people, even if it's through stimulus programs that are promoting youth employment. But those people need to be trained. You can't just walk into a schooling environment and hope for the best. And the last is around optimal classroom time. We're concerned that the departments of education across the board still don't have a recovery plan for what happened with the learning losses of the COVID period. And we're saying we insist one happens or isn't put in place as soon as possible. And a big part of it must be concentrating on this right to read and read for meaning at that.
I like that you mentioned the literacy training, Noncedo, because oftentimes some of these grade 4 learners come back home and they ask for help from the parent who themselves are not necessarily literate in that they cannot read in any language, right? How do we then jump that hurdle? You've mentioned these 4 things, a very crucial optimum classroom time as well. Beyond that, obviously, and you've just highlighted the fact that, matric is too late. By then, it's way too late. So if we can solve the problem sooner, let that be. What needs to happen to those children who are confronted with those environments at home where the parents themselves aren't necessarily literate?
The one is that during the COVID period, talking to learners very regularly, we learned that for many young children in South Africa, school is the safest environment they can be in. So being able to create a condition where learners can consistently be at school 5 days a week, no absenteeism, join reading clubs and programs and interventions that are being run in the schooling community is one way of making sure that we can work towards the same goal. The other is using public infrastructure in and around the school community, like public libraries, for example, that still have reading programs running, but need support. So people should also be looking at a local level. Go into your local library, figure out what it needs. Not everyone is reading off their tablets or Kindles or whatever kind of resources people have. The majority of young folk and people in our community still need and are to be using public libraries. The third thing to just mention to folks, that especially younger parents that are watching, is that what we're grappling here isn't the literacy rate of older generations in order to teach and support children in the home. It's your ability to teach reading and writing, which is a different kind of skill altogether. And that's the thing that we are concerned about, is building that kind of capacity across our schooling communities. Now, you've got really good programs, things like Funza, Nalibali, WordWorks, that have reading groups and formations in communities across the country. And so if people please do reach out to us, and you do know of a group of young people or children or parents that you think would need that kind of support and capacity, we're open to doing that. But these are the conditions, and this is something that we want to build into the ethos and the culture of how South Africans think and operate with their children and with themselves. This idea of an absolute right to read as being a crucial and a contingent part of your right to living. We think it is the best way for people to think about this. So act locally wherever you are, and if you've got resources that can help us with systemic interventions that help others across the board, across the country, or across your province, please reach out to us on social media and we make it happen. But we're committed to making sure that we can try and make some movement towards the 2030.
That was Noncedo Madubedube. Thank you so much for your time this morning, and just basically sharing a picture of how we can go about resolving this issue of 81% of our 4th grade learners not being able to read for meaning or understanding in any language. Obviously, there are organizations like Nalibali, Funza, which can help you as a young parent as well just attain the skill of helping your child to read and write. So a big thank you to Noncedo Madubedube from Equal Education.